What would you do if you were home alone and heard footsteps behind you, even though no one was there? Let me tell you a story that will make you question your safety the next time you're alone. You stand there, frozen, your heart racing, and the silence around you begins to feel wrong. Every shadow in the room seems to stretch longer, darker. You turn around, but there's nothing. No one. And yet, the footsteps, they don't stop. How would you react? What would you do if you knew you were not really alone? Stick around, because what I'm about to share with you will make you think twice before you close your eyes tonight. Meet Sarah. A young woman, just like many of us, who found herself in a very familiar place. One quiet evening, with her parents away on a weekend trip, Sarah was left alone in the family house, a house that had been her sanctuary for as long as she could remember. To Sarah, being home alone wasn't unusual. In fact, she had grown accustomed to it. The house was big and old, but it was where she felt safe. The rooms were filled with the scent of old wood and the faint scent of her mother's perfume lingering in the air. The house had its own rhythm, the slow creak of the floorboards as the house settled, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the comforting glow of the dim light above the stove. It was her world, a place of solace and routine. On this night, like many others, Sarah had settled in with a book. The evening was still, the night creeping in slowly through the windows. The sky was a deep navy blue, the stars faintly twinkling beyond the distant clouds. She wrapped herself in a blanket on the couch, her eyes scanning the pages of her book, completely unaware of the subtle shift happening around her. Sarah could hear the wind howling outside, the trees swaying as if whispering secrets. But inside, everything was quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, making you feel cocooned, almost safe. The walls of the house seemed to breathe with her, each exhale of the house in rhythm with her own. But then, as she sat there, reading, something in the atmosphere began to change. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. A subtle shift. A shift in the air. The first hint that something wasn't right. The soft, almost imperceptible sound of the floorboards creaking. It was as though the house was moving, adjusting, or maybe even waiting. But Sarah, wrapped up in her book, didn't notice it immediately. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, as houses often do. A slight shift here, a creak there. Nothing to worry about. But then it happened again. Another creak. A footstep? Maybe. But that didn't make sense. She was alone. She knew she was. The house was empty, and yet, the sound, it felt deliberate. Like someone was walking, just out of sight. Sarah sat up straighter, her attention torn from her book. The noise, no, the footsteps, were getting closer. One step. Then another. Faint but undeniable. It was as though someone was pacing, taking their time, carefully moving from room to room, but no one was there. Her eyes darted to the front door. Locked. The windows shut tight. She stood up, her feet light on the floor, and moved cautiously toward the hallway. She walked slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster, the floorboards creaking under her steps. The house was still, too still. The smell of the old wood grew stronger now, as if the very house itself was pressing in on her. She shook her head, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the house just settling. She wasn't going to be afraid. But then, she heard something she couldn't explain. A whisper. It was soft at first, like a breeze through the trees. Then it came again. Her name. Sarah. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The whisper was clear, as if it came from the very walls themselves. It made her freeze in her tracks, her pulse suddenly racing. She turned quickly, her heart racing as the cold air in the room seemed to drop even lower. Sarah stood in the hallway, straining her ears. No more footsteps. No more whispers. Just the heavy, suffocating silence. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. She didn't know it yet, but the house was no longer just a place she'd called home. It had become something else, a place of hidden darkness, and what was waiting for Sarah in the shadows was something far more terrifying than she could imagine. At first, it was harmless enough. A few creaks in the floorboards, a flicker of the lights, the sort of things anyone might brush off as nothing more than the house settling, the usual sounds of an old home adjusting to the shift in temperature and time. Sarah was used to the old house's quirks. The wind rattling the windows, the hum of the refrigerator, the creaks in the floor when she walked. It was just part of being alone in a house this old. She shrugged it off, lost in her thoughts, her book still in her hands. But then, as the minutes stretched on, the noises didn't fade away. Instead, they lingered. A slight creak in the hallway. A tapping, almost like someone rapping on the door. At first, she told herself it was the house settling, maybe even the wind, but it was strange, she didn't remember hearing these sounds before. The house had never felt quite so alive with noise, so restless. As Sarah sat there, staring at the flickering light, she suddenly noticed something else. The front door, which she had locked just before settling down with her book, was slightly ajar. At first, she thought maybe she had forgotten to lock it, perhaps the wind had blown it open, or maybe she'd been distracted. But deep down, a strange feeling of unease began to settle in. Sarah stood up slowly, her heart thudding in her chest as she approached the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but when she checked, she found the lock was still in place. The door hadn't opened by accident. It wasn't the wind. She could feel it now, a tightness in her chest, a pressure in the air. Something was wrong. She didn't know what, but she knew that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding or an innocent mistake. The door had been locked. She had locked it. And yet, here it was, slightly open, inviting something unwanted, inside. With the door closed again, Sarah stepped back into the hallway. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the air felt thick, heavy. It wasn't just the door. It was the silence that now surrounded her, pressing in from every corner. The house seemed unnervingly still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The kind of stillness that made her skin prickle, that made her feel watched. Every time Sarah moved, the silence felt heavier. It was as though something unseen was observing her, following her every movement. Her steps seemed to echo louder in the empty house, the shadows in the corners growing thicker with each passing second. She looked around, but the house was empty. Or was it? She turned to look over her shoulder, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling. The unsettling sensation that she wasn't truly alone, that someone, or something, was in the house with her. The air seemed to pulse, growing thick, as if every inch of space was charged with the presence of an unseen watcher. Her own breath felt heavy, as if the house itself was breathing with her, with anticipation. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the house, the old house, full of memories and strange noises. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She had never felt this before. This wasn't just the old house creaking. No. This was something else. Something waiting. Watching. Every time she moved, every step she took, that feeling grew stronger. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The shadows seemed to shift with her, moving in ways that didn't make sense. And then, just as she was about to turn into the living room, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking across the floor above her. The footsteps didn't stop. They were steady. Purposeful. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining it. The footsteps were real. She wasn't alone. She wasn't sure who, or what, was in the house with her, but one thing was clear: the house was no longer just a home. It had become something else. Something that watched, waited, and moved when she wasn't looking. She stood there in the hallway, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The footsteps, were they someone outside? No. It had to be. But the door was locked. The windows, shut. Her breath hitched in her throat, the fear crawling up her spine like fingers digging into her flesh. Something was behind her. Something was following her. The wind howled outside, a wild, restless force slamming against the windows. The kind of wind that rattled the trees and made the house groan and creak. But inside, there was no breeze. The air felt unnervingly still. It was thick with tension, like the air was too heavy to breathe, like it was holding its breath. Something was waiting, something was wrong. Then, she heard it. Soft at first, like a murmur in the distance, just out of reach of her understanding. Whispers. No words, just voices, like faint echoes coming from the walls. She stopped breathing for a moment, straining to listen, but the words were too soft, too faint to make out. It was as if the house itself was speaking, but in a language she couldn't understand. A language she wasn't meant to hear. Yet, the whispers persisted, growing louder in her mind, drawing her attention, pulling her deeper into the darkness of the house. Sarah tried to shake it off, to convince herself that it was just the wind, or maybe the old pipes groaning. But the feeling of unease deepened. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, as if something, or someone, was trying to speak to her. The sound was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the very air. She couldn't escape it. It was closing in on her, pressing down from all sides. The house, once a place of safety, was turning into something else. Something that wanted her to listen, wanted her to know that she wasn't alone. As Sarah stood there in the hallway, the house seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in closer. It wasn't just the whispers, it was the sense of being surrounded, trapped. Every corner felt like it was closing in on her, every shadow stretching further, like it was creeping toward her, inch by inch. The house, the very place she once felt safe, had transformed into a maze of dark corners, hidden spaces, and unseen threats. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the house. But her feet wouldn't move. The air was thick with a presence she couldn't explain, a presence that made every move feel like it was being watched. She turned around, eyes darting nervously from corner to corner, but the house was silent. Too silent. Nothing moved. No more footsteps. No more whispers. But Sarah knew. She could feel it. Something wasn't right. Trying to distract herself, Sarah reached for the remote, desperate to break the silence, to give herself something to hold on to. She turned on the TV, but as the screen flickered to life, the image was nothing but static, a jumbled mess of black and white, crackling with interference. She stared at it, confused. The TV had worked fine earlier, but now it was nothing but noise. The room felt colder, the silence more oppressive. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen, as if it held her captive, as if something in the static was trying to reach out to her. And that's when she heard it. A sound from somewhere below. A soft creak, followed by a loud thud. The basement door, which had always been tightly closed, now creaked open on its own. Sarah's blood ran cold. The basement door had never opened by itself before. She had made sure it was locked earlier. But now, it was wide open, slowly inching wider, as if something, or someone, had just stepped through it. But no one was downstairs, or was there? Sarah stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the dark opening of the basement. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind racing to explain what she was seeing. The door hadn't been opened before. She knew it. She had checked. She had locked it. But now it was wide open, beckoning her toward the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging her to come closer. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet refused to move. Her body was frozen, caught between fear and curiosity. What was in that basement? With every passing second, the air seemed to thicken, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The house wasn't just watching her anymore, it was alive. It was alive, and it wanted her to enter the shadows, to cross the threshold into the unknown. Her heart raced as she stood there in the hallway, the basement door looming before her like an ominous void. The cold air around her seemed to pull her in, urging her toward the darkness. The door creaked again, as if beckoning her, inviting her to cross the threshold into the unknown. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to lock herself in a room, to barricade herself somewhere safe. But she couldn't. She couldn't ignore it. The door, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it all felt like it was pulling her, drawing her closer. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling, but just as her hand made contact, the lights above her flickered. Once. Twice. Then they went out completely, leaving her in the dark. A suffocating darkness that seemed to wrap itself around her like a suffocating shroud. And suddenly, she wasn't alone anymore. The shadows that had once felt safe, familiar, now seemed to stretch, twist, and writhe in the dim light, as if they were alive. Moving. Inching closer. She could feel them, feel the weight of the darkness closing in around her. A chill ran down her spine, and she turned, her eyes wide with terror. There, just out of the corner of her vision, she could see them. Figures. Dark silhouettes standing in the hallway. Watching her. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. Sarah froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. The shadows. They weren't moving like normal shadows. They were moving with purpose, like they were alive. Her mind raced, trying to understand what she was seeing. But there was no time. The moment of terror had arrived. She had to run. Just as she turned to run, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. The sound was deafening, like something heavy had been thrown across the room, or like a door had been slammed open with incredible force. Sarah didn't need to check. She knew. Something was up there with her. Something, or someone. Her legs were frozen, but the terror was suffocating. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she tried to move, tried to break free from the grip of fear that had taken hold of her. But the shadows, they were closing in. She could feel them, hear them, their whispers growing louder, clearer, as if they were speaking directly into her mind. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The air grew thick with pressure, and the whispers started to form words, though she could barely make them out. Sarah, come closer, her legs buckled, and her vision blurred as the shadows pressed in from every direction, blocking her way. She felt a presence behind her, felt something cold and heavy breathe down her neck, its breath like ice against her skin. She spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Only the darkness. Only the feeling that whatever was there, was now inside her mind, inside her very thoughts. And then it happened. The final, horrifying moment. The door to the basement slammed shut with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. The lights flickered once more, casting shadows in every corner, but in that moment, the house itself seemed to groan, like it was alive. Alive and angry. Something was trapped inside with her. And it was closing in fast. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Sarah." The voice was so faint, so soft, yet it was unmistakable. It came from the basement. From the shadows. And it was waiting for her. The night ended in confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. When the police arrived, they immediately began to search the house, their flashlights sweeping through every room. Sarah was found shaken, barely able to speak, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed to the basement door. But when they entered, there was nothing. No intruders. No signs of a break-in. No one, nothing, was there. The officers went through the house thoroughly, checking each room, each window, each door. They couldn't find a trace of anyone, no signs that anyone had been inside the house with her. The door to the basement. Locked. The windows. Secure. Everything was in its place. As if nothing had ever happened at all. But then, something caught their attention. A small, old photo, tucked away behind a stack of forgotten papers in a drawer. The edges were curled and faded with age, but the image was still clear enough to make out. It was a photograph of the house, but something about it felt wrong. The house looked completely different, older, with fewer renovations, but still unmistakably the same place. In the photograph, a family stood outside the house, smiling in front of a door Sarah knew all too well. But there was something unsettling about the image. The family looked eerily familiar. The faces were blurry, hard to make out, but the features, the shape of them, seemed like they could belong to Sarah's own family. The same eyes. The same hair. The same smiles, yet, something was off. But it wasn't just the family that caught their attention. No, it was something far more disturbing. In the photo, standing by the basement door, was a shadowy figure. A figure that seemed to fade into the darkness, but even through the blur of time and age, it was unmistakable. The figure was tall, dark, and yet its face seemed strangely familiar. Too familiar. The strangest part. In that old, faded photo, the shadowy figure wasn't a stranger. No. It wasn't someone from the past. It looked exactly like Sarah. Her own face, indistinct and shadowed, stood by the basement door, a face she hadn't seen anywhere else, a face that shouldn't have been there at all. Sarah stared at the photo, her heart racing. She couldn't breathe. The officers tried to reassure her that it was just an old photograph, a coincidence, but deep down, Sarah knew the truth. The shadows in the basement. The whispers. The presence in the house. The face in the photo, it all pointed to one chilling conclusion: the house wasn't just haunted by what had happened. It was haunted by something that had never truly left. The whispers returned, faint, barely audible. But Sarah heard them. "Sarah, you're one of us now." The words echoed in her mind, over and over. And as she stood there, staring at the photograph, a new realization began to sink in: the house had always been a part of her. It had always known her, and it had been waiting for her all along. She left the house that night, but the image of the photo, the shadowy figure by the basement door, stayed with her. And now, every time she looked into a mirror, every time she turned a corner, she couldn't shake the feeling: something was always watching. And it had been watching her for a lot longer than she had ever realized. What would you do if you were home alone and heard footsteps behind you, even though no one was there? Would you try to investigate, braving the unknown? Or would you run, hoping the danger would pass you by? I want to know what you would do. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something spooky in your own home? Something that made you question whether you were truly alone? I'd love to hear your story. Share it with me in the comments. If you want to hear more true, terrifying stories just like this one, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a creepy tale. I post new stories regularly, each one designed to keep you on the edge of your seat. And don't forget to leave a comment telling me what you think.